Lovely to see everybody. Hello. It's a great privilege for me to introduce Emily Apter and to act as moderator for this talk that I've been looking forward to for a while. Emily is an inspirational scholar. I think anybody who's a serious student of translation and world literature will inevitably be drawn to engage with her work. As you're going to see in this session, though, Emily is also an inspirational and extremely generous interlocutor. And I've enjoyed engaging with her work for a while now in the areas of French studies, where we both began our careers, but also in comparative literature and world literature, and obviously, as interests us now, the area of translation studies. Emily Apter is Silver Professor of French and Comparative Literature at New York University. Her books include Unexceptional Politics, On Obstruction, Impasse, and the Impolitic, which came out with Verso in 2018, Against World Literature, On the Politics of Untranslatability from 2013. She co-edited with Barbara Cassin, Jacques Lesra, and Michael Wood, Dictionary of Untranslatables, a philosophical lexicon in 2014. And just to mention also an important book, I think, for our purposes from 2006, The Translation Zone, a New Comparative Literature. Since 2000, Emily has edited the book series Translation with Princeton University Press. And in addition to the monographs and edited volumes I've mentioned, her influential essays have appeared in October, Public Culture, Diacritics, PMLA, Comparative Literature, Paragraph, Boundary 2, Critical Inquiry. I could carry on all of the influential journals in the areas across which she works. In 2019, Emily was the Daimler Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. Shortly before that, 2017 to 18, she served as president of the American Comparative Literature Association. Just before I hand over to mention a recent publication, in 2022, she co-edited and introduced Gayatri Spivak's Living Translation, a really important collection of Spivak's contributions to translation theory, and her ongoing book project, What is Just Translation, takes up questions of translation and justice across media and the limits of translation as a medial form. The talk tonight is called Cosmopolitanism in Translation and Zones of Untranslatability, and it's an absolute pleasure, Emily, to hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you to Dr. Munira Gadir. It's a true honor to be with you and to be invited to be part of this project of the UNESCO Chair. I thank the King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies. And again, the Translating Cultures Lab, which obviously is a very engaged and compelling context for presenting this talk. And as you already saw a little bit on the preamble blurb that I sent in advance, I'm going to be looking at a narrative, we could call it Euro-cosmopolitanism, associated with an attitude or a state of mind or an urbane way of living, shaped by something we might think of as the translational ecumen, a kind of turn or cosmopolis even. And I would say that the Euro-cosmopolitan narrative starts to shift when strands of a counter-cosmopolitan terrestrial humanism began to emerge, bringing with them new approaches to the understanding of knowledge production in a global frame. What came to the fore, I'll suggest, is a critical cosmopolitics as a distinct from cosmopolitanism, emphasizing planetary concept work, linguistic ecologies, and forms of global language justice that reckon with zones of untranslatability. And so in today's talk, I'll offer an overview of some of these conceptual transformations and raise some points for discussion about untranslatability as a critical tool of the comparative humanities. It's a rather controversial concept, I'll have to say that, and I'm happy to address this in conversation. I find it often misunderstood or taken at it in a very literal way when, as you'll see from the way I work with it, untranslatability is not against translation. It is about a form of translation that recognizes or reckons with the things that a kind of right to opacity, to borrow a phrase of Edouard Glissant, that he used in several contexts. So let me begin first with this discussion of the Eurocentric term cosmopolitanism, because I think it remains a key word of post-Westphalian diplomacy, associated historically with citizenship of the world, free trade, legal contract as foundational to civil society, the mutual recognition among sovereign nations, and adherence to maritime law and universal human rights. It came to be attached to Hannah Arendt's ideal of the right to have rights as a fundamental remit of citizenship, to Habermasian norms of enlarged access to the public sphere and technologies of literacy, and to liberal rules of late liberal rules of humane international engagement. This is the subject of Samuel Moyn's interesting book, Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. As an Enlightenment and Romantic form of savoir-vivre, cosmopolitanism, as I've already suggested, conjured a predisposition of openness towards worldly knowledge formation, cultural translation, which was crucial to Goethe's invention of world literature, and democratic humanism, the latter defined by a vision of secular European cultural unity that, in the face of industrialization and Fordism, could stand down mass culture and linguistic standardization. For a generation of exiled European philologists during World War II, many of whom ended up in literature departments in the United States, European cultural unity had to be protected at all costs. This objective came through clearly in Erich Auerbach's introduction to literary language and its public in late Latin antiquity and in the Middle Ages. We can have the first slide, or the next slide, please, where he wrote, European civilization is approaching. Could we have the next slide? Sorry. If not, it's okay. Maybe we don't have, there we go. European civilization is approaching the term of its existence. Its history as a distinct entity would seem to be at an end, for already it is beginning to be engulfed in another, more comprehensive unity. Later in his signal essay, Philologie and Weltliteratur, Auerbach warned that historical synthesis produced by carefully binding the material fragments of aesthetic culture into a common whole would combust if it were overextended. In so many words, this amounted to securing the Europhone canon and the classical high culture of ancient worlds and sacred texts. Like Auerbach, Edward Said placed great value on humanist synthesis, but he had his work cut out for him, fashioning a democratic humanism for a post-colonial world. Though he shared Auerbach's grand-scaled ambition toward a worldly form of literary criticism, and this, as you'll recall, Said actually wrote the preface to an edition of Auerbach's Mimesis, and he remained an Auerbachian really until the end of his career in many ways. Still, he gave no truck to Auerbach's Orientalist Eurocentrism. When Auerbach wrote in Philologie, Philologie der Weltliteratur, that, quote, our philological home is the earth, it can no longer be the nation, and this became a kind of foundation, key point for comparative literature in its post-war construction as a discipline. Said rejoins his earthly home is European culture. So if in the end Said was able to recoup part of the Auerbachian project, it was by stressing the fact, and this is a quote, that Mimesis could only have been written in Istanbul, which is to say, in a place of distance from the Judeo-Christian tradition that called forth new kinds of filiation and affiliations. In The World, the Text, and the Critic, from 1983, and in books published toward the end of his life that include his memoir, Out of Place, which recounts growing up in Palestine, Said developed a counter-cosmopolitanism, or more specifically, what I've called a terrestrial humanism, that was quite literally grounded in the politics of land claims, the Palestinian right of return, and an earthly appreciation of the territorial habitus as locus of cultural formation. Some of its seeds could in fact be found in Auerbach's 1929 monograph, Dante, Poet of the Secular World, whose German title, Dante als Dichter der irdischen Welt, underscored not only the irdisch, the earthly dimension of Roman imperialism, which aspired to be the secular equivalent on earth of a divine order, but also referenced the vivid image repertories of material life by which Dante produced the effects of historical experience and incarnate subjectivity. Said's terrestrial humanism salvaged select portions of the cosmopolitan inheritance bequeathed to comparative literature by the exiled European philologists. Focusing on culture's interpolation by empire, his practice of contrapuntal reading paved the way for a decolonial, planetary mode of critical practice open to indigenous cosmologies and committed to redressing the overriding whiteness of Euro-cosmopolitanism's concept of culture. His attention to territoriality heralded a contemporary comparative literature geared to mass diasporas and to what Matthew Hart identifies as extraterritorial zones, which is to say, disaggregated political geographies that include extra-state sites of rendition and detention. So he's thinking also of how the war on terror has created these other sites that need to be included in this notion of an extraterritorial zone or of territoriality. Said's efforts to preserve a cosmopolitan disposition within post-colonial humanism as an ideal of world space and common ground, or Weltkultur, stood against a general waning of the term's appeal by the mid-20th century. Several factors were responsible for this waning. Cosmopolitanism carried a lot of negative baggage as a term of stigma, racist othering, and ethnic slur. You'll recall the Stalinist epithet, rootless cosmopolitan, for Jews denounced for being under bourgeois Western influence, and later as a term that conjured privileged, predominantly white intellectual communities. As Bruce Robbins notes, the term was applied often venomously to Christians, aristocrats, merchants, Jews, homosexuals, and intellectuals, and you can add to this list. Second reason it wanes, it was predicated on universalist constructs of knowledge that made it vulnerable to the kind of critique developed by Michel Foucault, who, from The Order of Things and Archaeology of the Human Sciences, to his essay in 1984, What is Enlightenment?, dismantled epistemic systems as structures of power, exposing their instrumentalization in the state apparatus of surveillance and punishment, as well as in extra-state, informal, self-regulatory modes of social control. A third factor, I mean, we can keep enumerating them, but I think this one it was the shift in post-war global power dynamics from Britain to America, which conscripted cosmopolitan internationalism in the service of what Serge Guilbault termed the demarxization of the intelligentsia. This soft power cosmopolitanism was supported by economic and cultural organizations, a number of them with ties to American intelligence, such as the United States Agency for International Development, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations, to name but a few. In the early 1990s and in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fate of cosmopolitanism took another turn. Jacques Derrida and Etienne Balibar displaced it with the term cosmopolitics, associated at a time of European border anxieties and rising anti-immigration sentiment with what they called a citizen subject, entitled by right to hospitality. Much of this thinking culminated in Balibar's 2016 broadside, Europe, Crisis and End, with a question mark, which it's actually was never translated in English, in which he articulated the urgent need to reinvent political concepts and minoritized names. Political categories, he affirmed, need to be changed. The old ones have changed in meaning. Notions of migration, borders, territory, population cannot be used as before, as we've seen already with terms like money, citizenship, and work. This was as Balibar. For Balibar, writing the language of migration in the sense of putting it back on political course or restoring political rights to those whose language is treated as suspect or whose claims remain unlanguaged in any tongue, belonged to a larger project of rethinking what Europe is as a territory of cosmopolitical right, the latter defined in Kant as a universal system of juridical norms and a kind of moral destination of humankind, according to which the ultimate moral end or purposefulness of reason will transcend the simple sphere of positive law. Balibar, we could say, comes up with this idea of translating Europe by means of a political philology. That term is my own. A political philology of statelessness, detention zones, camps, settlements, and what we might think of more existentially as unsettled existence. In another text called Cosmopolitics from Borders to the Human Species, Balibar identifies cosmopolitics with a polity of the human species, not in the exceptionalist sense of human only or human as premier species, but of human as coefficient of other political modes, insurrection, emancipation, the transformation of social relations and collective subjectivities, all responsive to the condition of catastrophic mondialisation or globalization. In its species orientation, Balibarian cosmopolitics complements the work of thinkers like Isabel Stengers, Eduardo Viveros de Castro, and Philippe Descola on multi-natural perspectivism, a paradigm that, in addition to challenging the foundational anthropocentrism of Western humanism, introduces unlimited strata of species and orders of life into cosmological schemata. All these theories of cosmopolitics build on what Robbins and Cha dubbed actually existing cosmopolitanism. They retain that term, cosmopolitanism, and they cue it to, quote, transnational experiences that are particular rather than universal and that are unprivileged, indeed often coerced, end of quote. With this transnationalization of cosmopolitanism, they contributed to a revival of the older term, especially in relation to global language politics. And this is an area that's, I think, exploding in fascinating ways, the sphere of global language politics. Sheldon Pollock applied it to the vernacularization of Southern Asia from the medieval Sanskrit cosmopolis to the globalized present. We can have the next slide, please. Following on, thank you, a younger generation of literary scholars has been rethinking the vernacular cosmopolis. Askia Saksena's Vernacular English, Reading the Anglophone in Post-Colonial India, which was published in 2023, looks at how English functions as one of many South Asian vernaculars marked by colonialism and the historic dominance of the Anglophone elite, but no longer overdetermined by it. It's one of many Indian languages, as part of her argument. The book provokes a broader interrogation of how a language comes to establish its authority and presence within overlapping cultures, not just through education and state bureaucracies, but through its materialization on billboards and storefronts, in mass media, and in spoken exchanges across caste and community. We can have the next slide. Like Ronit Ricci's Islam Translated, in which Southern and Southeast Asia is characterized as an Arabic cosmopolis, Annette Damayanti Linau's Sacred Language, Vernacular Difference, Global Arabic and Counter-Imperial Literatures, examines Arabic usage across vast regional distances and social contexts. Linau attends to sorry, I'm going to have to kill my phone here. It's making noise. Stop. Okay, sorry about that. Linau's Sacred Language examines Arabic usage across vast regional distances and social contexts. Linau attends to distinctive uses of sacred Arabic, the cosmopolitan Arabic of elites, often associated with traditions of adab, and colloquial speech that gives identity to micro-communities, while at the same time forging what Andrew Brandel calls the prosody of social ties. Linau's model of multiple Arabics, dynamically mediated by print, literary experimentalism, and transcultural vernacular, emerges as a powerful cosmopolitical corrective to the static representation of Arabic that was familiarly propounded by the 19th and 20th century European Orientalists. You're getting some Manhattan background music here from the emergency vehicles. Sorry about that. In works like those of Pollock, Ricci, Saxena, and Linau, cosmopolitanism is returned to relevance as the name for a vernacular language politics, with ramifications as a political concept applied well outside the confines of the metropolitan salons and university redoubts of cultured exiles, where it had originally taken hold as a cultural idea. In its newer guises, cosmopolitanism refers to provincialized Europe, to urban communities and diasporas, to the technosphere's dissemination of information, to cultural commodities and cryptocurrency within digital infrastructures, to cognitive ecologies and diffuse notions of environment and milieu, tantamount to a reworked notion of Carl Schmitt's notion of the nomos of the earth. Schmitt had already reworked the ancient Greek notion of nomos, which is roughly translated as law, polis, order of the earth, or primordial measure of all measures. He'd already invoked this for a legal theory of justice, first in his book on the 3 types of juristic thought from the 30s, and later in a 1950 legal treatise, The Nomos of the Earth in the International Law of the Jus Publicum Europaeum. In the later work, it was defined as the first land appropriation, understood as the first partition and classification of space for division and distribution. Throughout his work, Nomos emerges not just in the laws and social customs of a people, but in the cuts and divisions of territory, agricultural gridding, livestock penning, the forced relocation of indigenous communities, the housing of people in human parks and carceral spaces. It records earthly incisions, such as mining or resource extractivism, racialized modes of production, the shifting temporal coordinates of climate change from the Holocene to the Anthropocene to the Capitalocene, and to what's sometimes referred to as the patchwork apartheid of migration management, referring to the legal and physical waste stationing of asylum seekers inside Western urban capitals. This is not how Schmidt is applying it, by the way. It's how it has been extrapolated from Schmidt. We can have the next slide, please. In Jenny Erpenbeck's novel, Go, Went, Gone, the original German Gehen, Ging, Gegangen, whose title references the German verb tenses mastered in obligatory language instruction classes given to asylum seekers. This alter cosmopolitan nomos appears in the guise of, this is a beautiful figure you can see in the passage, of a bureaucratic geometry, a parcellation of administrative formalities mapped onto institutional settings that demarcate the legal strictures, disempowering refugees from the right to live and work in the place of their arrival. And I can quickly read this. For a year and a half, anyone who wanted to could speak with the refugees in the middle of the city. He himself could have done so. I'll say this is the professor. He himself could have done so a couple of weeks ago on his park bench, but the moment they signed an agreement, it became necessary to administer them. Bureaucratic geometry. He read this term a few days ago in a book by a historian on the consequences of colonialism. The colonizers smothered in bureaucracy, which is a pretty clever way to keep them from taking political action. When the protagonist of the novel, a recently retired professor of classics and philology, traverses Oranienplatz and calls up memories of this Kreuzberg neighborhood, he contrasts its past, marked by the quartier's Huguenot refugees who had been avid gardeners, or the square designed by the 19th century Prussian urban planner Pierre-Joseph Lenné, with its present, now marked as an area resembling, quote, a construction site, a landscape of tents, wooden shacks, and tarps, white, blue, and green, populated by Black men and white sympathizers. Oranienplatz thus becomes what I would think of as a translational toponym on the order of what Achille Mbembe, in Out of the Dark Night, calls a, quote, migrant and circulatory form of modernity, born of overlapping genealogies at the intersections of multiple encounters with multiple elsewheres. He also qualifies it as an Afropolitan site of Black diasporic hope and trans-ethnic solidarity, as well as the name for the long history of the Earth's racialized nomos. We can have the next slide, please. In Planetary Longings, Mary Louise Pratt describes a planetary cosmopolis that complements Mbembe's Afropolitan geography of the racialized nomos. Drawing on a planetary heuristics hailing from the global south, Pratt's cosmopolitanism is all about decentering and realigning where the cultural reader is coming from in taking on the task of world making. And she writes, as humans and other life forms are increasingly subject to processes they do not control, knowledge makers are oddly freed from the demand to predict, model, specify, explain. A new openness to unpredictability enables a shift out of the systemic. things that used to look like categories, structures, or systems start appearing as forces that can operate at any range and scale and have the ability to make things happen in any context in which they come into play. In the way we know warming temperatures will make things happen, but no longer expect to fully know what things. With that kind of unpredictability comes improvisation. Now, this is interesting because Pratt associates the planetary with anxieties hailing from the status and uses of vernacular culture. That's where the cosmopolitanism comes in, especially in contact zones with pop cultural responses to life-destroying forces of globalization, sometimes in figures of invading monsters or allegories of civic breakdown or crises of futurity, and with mobility and travel at the intersection of migration, ecology, militarism, and tourism, and also with the impact of indigeneity on Western epistemes. So you can see here that through this question of how we approach the planetary, the cosmopolitan is being really radically changed and shifted. With its non-predictive ethnographies of global connection, standing in for the old cosmopolitanism, Pratt's model of planetary world-making covers wide-ranging themes, many of them building on the anxiety and uncanniness that characterized Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak's notion of planetarity. Put into circulation in a 1997 paper entitled Imperatives to Reimagine the Planet, as a counterweight to globe and globalization, its principal function was to mark a distance taking from what Spivak called planet talk. Planet talk translates, according to Spivak, the interest of globalization in the mode of the abstract as such. It uses the cover of sustainability to keep geology safe for good imperialism or to provide an alibi for good capitalism. Planet talk presupposes Western reason and universalism, whereas planetarity is a mode of alterity, positioning Aboriginal animism in dialectical relation to quote the spectral white mythologies of post-rational science. We can have the next slide, please. In the Welleck Lectures, published as Death as a Discipline in 2004, Spivak emphasized the experiential dimension of alterity as it cuts against anthropocentric hubris and possessive agency and enhances consciousness of the fact that living entities inhabit the planet on loan. And the paragraph below is just kind of wordy, it's my own. What we have here is an economy of loanship. I'd like to think more about that. I just sort of, an economy of loanship, not the kind of capitalist loan that enacts interest payments, a moral attitude of beholdenness to the lender, or a racial subsidy measured in unpayable debt, but something more like the loanship of loanwords that traverse pre- and post-colonial time zones and cultural configurations that ground and unground sectorized knowledge systems. In my reading of Spivak, planetarity is identified with the critique of monolingualisms and Eurocentrisms within the default categories of comparatism, as well as with forms of concept work that are crucial to analyzing what I and others have termed untranslatables. Can I have the next slide, please? The French philosopher and classicist Barbara Cassin introduced the term intraduisible in the subtitle of the French edition of the book she really conceived and put together. You can see it in the vitrine down on the left there, the Vocabulaire européen des philosophies dictionnaire des intraduisibles. A history from translation's point of view The volume's English title became, and you can't make it out, but it's there on the right in the red edition of the red English edition. We translated it as Dictionary of Untranslatables, a Philosophical Lexicon. And by the way, this book is having many lives in other languages. And so it's a kind of translational object of knowledge that's constantly being transformed. It is a cosmopolitan book. Where Cassin used the untranslatable as shorthand for what she called philosophizing in languages, I extended its applications in my own work to modes of what I called theorizing in untranslatables. A transposition meant to signal how theory, rather than the historic discipline of philosophy, had become a catch-all in England, in Anglophone parlance, for a continually evolving mix of continental philosophy and cultural studies, the latter inclusive of critical race theory, gender and sexuality studies, psychoanalysis, and decolonial theory, and much else. What was important about Cassin's approach to philosophy was its refusal to practice classical concept history or Begriffsgeschichte along the lines defined by Reinhard Koselleck. Cassin treated concept words not as transparent names for timeless, universal, freestanding ideas, typical of many encyclopedias of philosophy oriented to the Western tradition. For Cassin, the untranslatable was not a property of exceptionalism conferred on elected keywords. This, by the way, is commonly misunderstood. And so I want to kind of underscore that. It's not a property of exceptionalism, but rather force of energia and dynamis, animating language as a living thing and inhering in all lexical particles. The untranslatable alluded to the becoming philosophical potential of all language, as well as the identifying symptoms of terms that could become philosophical or become philosopheme. These symptoms included frequent mistranslation, non-translation, or constant retranslation. So untranslatability is associated with these processes, not with some fixed refusal to translate. Untranslatables were sometimes recognized as words that run interference in communication, causing category confusion, or even the chaos of a verbal hack. They joggle conventional meanings from their mental grooves. The untranslatable, in short, does things with and to words, making it in some ways the offspring of J.L. Austin's theory of linguistic performatives, and opening the door of canonical Western thought to a post-colonial world of other epistemologies, other forms of poetic opacity, and possibilities of relation. Very Glissantian inspiration there. A massive exercise in comparative comparatism at the micro level of the episteme lexeme, the dictionary sought to avoid imposing what Glissant called la fixité tyrannique, the tyrannical fixity, on relational thought and on the practice of translanguaging more generally. It did fall short, inevitably, given its predominantly European purview, of fulfilling the task of remediating the Eurocentrism of philosophy as a Western-based discipline. And this task remains urgent. Introducing vocabularies hailing from the global South, creating lexicons that resonate beyond traditional knowledge fields and that tap into traditions of native cosmos or challenge tenets of Western logic. These are objectives, and we can have the next slide, please, that motivate Carol Gluck and Anna Lowenhout-Singh's Words in Motion toward a global lexicon. We can quickly put that slide up. Thank you. And we can have the next one now. As well as Dilip Menon's edited collection, Changing Theory, Concepts from the Global South. Now, this book's chapters are organized around concept terms that reactivate the unfinished intellectual and artistic legacies of tri-continental internationals. I'm thinking here of Afro-Asian solidarity movements in the wake of decolonization, the Bandung Conference, archipelagan consciousness as defined by Glissant, and epistemologies of the South as formulated by numerous Latin American theorists. The great theory shakeup, responding to Boaventura de Sousa Santos's crucial claim that, quote, there is no global social justice without global cognitive justice, forms part of a global epistemological revolution built on Gramscian notions of vernacular materialisms, where dialect, idiom, and dimensions of class struggle between what Gramsci calls the regional popular or immanent grammar and the national hegemonic or normative grammar underscore political dimensions of concept work. Here, language politics, regulated by hard and soft borders, and the eco-political fault lines of extraction capitalism, is reconceived within a linguistic continuum, a semiosphere that challenges single language models of vehicular grammar, along with capitalist investment in monolingualism. What distinguishes Menon's changing theory is the way in which it takes non-European languages at their words. The book's cover gets behind this vision, if you can barely make it out, I'm sorry, bad slide, by featuring a compass, its hand dial embossed with a Chinese character, surrounded by the volume's selected keywords in multiple languages across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and South America. For Menon, this compass signifies the reorientation of knowledge production, both within and beyond academic spaces. To call for decolonial modes of concept work, in lieu of, say, universal comparative paradigms, also leads us to the program of global language justice, laid out in a book of that title. We can have the next slide, final slide, in 2024, in a book of that title. In their introduction, editors Lydia Liu and Anupama Rao home in on the contracting life world of languages, underscoring the fact that ecological devastation aligns with the, quote, silent disappearance of thousands of human languages. Language loss, they insist, cannot be separated out from indigenous peoples' escape, flight, and forced migration as a consequence of colonial dispossession, deforestation, war, or climate change. Citing Daniel Nettle and Suzanne Romaine's Vanishing Voices, The Extinction of the World's Languages, in which these authors argue holistically that to understand why languages are born and why they die entails looking not just at the languages themselves, but at all aspects of the lives of the people who speak them. Liu and Rao state pointedly, quote, this is where an ecological conception of language can help. The attention to a critically and politically nuanced ecology of languages is especially productive in contributions that focus empirically on indigenous language extinction, while pushing back, as Wesley Leonard does in his essay in the volume, against narratives of endangered languages that reperform neocolonial postures of curatorial salvage. To speak of an endangered life world of languages, including those beyond the human, as a program of research and activism, helps make the case for translations enrollment in the project of building what Margaret Kovac has termed indigenous methodologies. The starting point in this case involves investigating the negative impact of forced conformity to regimes of English only in Native communities. On the negative impact of conformity to what in the German tradition is called Verstehen, the common understandings that serve as binding mechanisms of beliefs and practices. What comes to the fore is a connection between theories of justice and translation that emphasizes how expanded notions of colonial liability and responsibility can be marshaled to secure reparations for what Kovac calls linguistic genocide. Here, translation may be used to expose the universal epistemicidal application of Western legal frameworks. Maria Bo's essay in the Global Language Justice volume offers a pointed illustration of ununderstandings, conditions of Unverständlichkeit, produced by untranslatability effects in ecological covenants. Terms and predicate terms or notions of group, law, or equality interfered with at the level of language or of specific linguistic non-equivalence provoke a profound cognitive dissonance between Euro and native traditions of land integrity and common good. This is a problem of untranslatability, very pragmatically. What we have philosophically, juridically, and eco-politically speaking is a profound state of disconnect, a translation problem with very negative consequences for the politically disempowered. Such legal thickets of untranslatability beset and undermine protocols of legalistic procedure in the world courts. So here's my concluding paragraph. By taking stock of zones of untranslatability in the global sphere of language justice, and by expanding the right to language guaranteed in the 1996 Universal Declaration of Linguistic Rights, we're fighting for what Philippe Van Parijs calls in his book, Linguistic Justice for Europe and for the World, parity of esteem among the world's languages. This translational ecumen, which I began with, in its contemporary guises, advances new forms of knowledge production. It recasts the internationalist disposition of an older cosmopolitanism by aligning it with the language politics of vernacularization, with the articulation of a nomos in terms no longer exclusionary of indigenous rights and native ecologies, and with a global criticality, that expression is Spivak's, that builds out new vocabularies and grammars of transcultural comparatism. Thanks so much for your attention.
Emily, thank you for an extremely stimulating paper. A remarkable range of reference there. I think, as is so often the case with your work, an active historicization of contemporary concerns, but also that grounding of concepts and methods in their political contexts, and a questioning of the usefulness of political concepts as well, which I think is central to your call for linguistic justice. What struck me in particular, I think, for those of us following developments in translation studies, was your reflection around translation and ecology, with ecology understood in these broader frames, thinking about the globe and the planet, reflecting on linguistic ecologies as well, and the right to language. And I think that underpinning reflection on Anglo-normativity as a form of epistemicide was really very helpful for a number of the reflections that we've been engaging in through the Translating Cultures Lab and in the chair around the epistemological dimensions of debates around translation and untranslatability at the moment, which is where I think that emphasis that you ended with there on global criticality is so important, and the possibility of these debates around translation to allow us to think about the production of new forms of knowledge. So a remarkable paper. Thank you. I can see already that there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. If those attending would like to carry on adding questions there, we can come around to those. But if it's okay, I just wanted to start with to kick off with a couple of questions linked to my reactions, because and they're in some ways, Emily, they're around that notion of translatability, because what's central to your work is that conceptual richness and the generosity around suggesting methods which can be adopted across a range of contexts. And it struck me in the early stages when you were talking about Said, and came back to that notion of counterpoint. Um, and I'd be interested to hear more on your reflections on the links between contrapuntal reading and questions of translation and untranslatability, because counterpoint seems in part to be linked to that, the maintenance of tension, which is in the untranslatable that you talked about later in the paper.
That's a wonderful point. That's absolutely correct. That unsettledness in Said, that it's not that the counterpoint is simply the opposite. It's more of a, to use fancy words, a dialectical antinomy. It's a process that's unsettled, just as that almost rhymes with the political urgency of so much of his work. They're not detached, but I think it's sometimes been hard for readers of Said to see and fully comprehend how, the anti-imperialist practice of contrapuntal reading squares with this attachment to a democratic humanism. And so I was trying to say there really is a link, that's, even if you have to take recourse not just to Said's references, which are in some ways very Auerbachian or Freudian even, but to something like Schmidt, who has a terrible political reputation, but whose notion of nomos, and the emphasis on partition and the gridding of land and its conquest through extraction. This isn't something that Said himself went into in great depth. He was, but there is an attention to, it's almost as if you have to read all of Said together and, read Out of Place or After the Last Sky, where he gives this, incredible vision of what's happening to Palestinian lands through the construction of settlements, and he has a series of photographs. You have to read that in the context of seemingly contradictory traditions of cultural unity and synthesis and the kind of world compact. But he really did believe in that sense in a more traditional model of cosmopolitanism and of translation as a tool for finding points of cultural unity and synthesis. I almost think there's a kind of lapsed Christian side or ontotheological side of Said that is in tension with his interest in a culture of an Islamic culture. So all of these contradictions are in play. It's not just the contrapuntal reading, but I guess what I would say is that all of that is contained in contrapuntal reading for me. That's not just the fact that he reads Jane Austen against, the plantation. It's something much bigger than that. That is that comes from taking a really holistic view to the oeuvre, to the whole oeuvre, including his earliest work on Swift and satire, because there's a very, very sophisticated political irony that undermines taking a fixed position in Said. And so I think the Orientalism book is, of course, a monumental work, but sometimes it got interpreted in very binaristic ways that did a certain injustice to the complexities and instabilities in his thinking. The one thing I would say about Said, and in my own reading of him, particularly in some of his writings about the uses of Arabic in colonial contexts, is that he only here and there attends to translation. He's, I think, a translational thinker utterly, partly because of his formation and who he was and the places he occupied in the world stage, but also in his own upbringing and his education in America. He was such a part of a firmament, really, of a very almost old-fashioned literary establishment in the US. So, but always overturning it at the edges, unseating it in some way from within. But I think, in a sense, the Said that was handed to me that felt like still to do is the Said of translation studies. And I'm certainly not alone in that. Many have taken this on. There some of the editors like Amr Mufti and the Boundary 2 group, Stathis Gagouris. There are a whole host of people who have pushed questions around what does he mean by critical secularism into the question of language. And that this is where the question of sacred language and Westerners fall into cliches around what is a sacred language. We don't really know how to negotiate those usages very clearly. I think it's immensely complex across in the uses of Arabic across so many continents, really. And so this is another exciting area. That's why I picked out Linau's book, which is looking at the vernacularization of Arabics across vast regions. And these are, to me, still Saidian issues and questions, but he didn't necessarily focus on them. He was more of a reader of narrative. He was involved in poetics, but not the way, say, someone working on a ghazal would be. Mufti has a whole chapter on that, and the question of the language is really, really foregrounded. Said mentions terms that he considers almost terms that have had violence done to them in Arabic through their appropriation. And that's fascinating to me. Language is a site of language politics and of contest and of really profound cultural conflict. But he doesn't go further than that, really. I mean, his philology is more of an idealized Auerbachian philology of seeing the world in a certain way, without nations simply defining, or nationalisms confining forms of sovereignty and aligning them with national languages that become forms of colonialism. He's really a brilliant reader, for me anyway, of music, of narrative, of film even. But the more philology / poetics that involves deep work in translation, that I think that's a Saidian project to do. That's not something he himself really took on fully.
Emily, that was a wonderfully rich answer. And I think that that's sort of not only sort of paying homage to the complexity of Said's work, but also giving that sense of our responsibility as critics 20 years after his death to continue interrogating and being inspired by that incredible body of work. Thank you for that. Lots to think about there. Emily, I'm going to move into the chat now, because there are several questions there that I think we should address. The first one here from Abdul Rahman Al-Baladi on ethics. So how can cosmopolitanism reframe the ethics of translation? I'm particularly curious about how cultural nuances that resist easy translation and challenge universalist interpretation.
Yes, lovely question. I mean, I think it's far easier for people to embrace an ethics of translation because it implies an almost Levinasian approach to the neighbor, a kind of embrace of the other or of universal hospitality, as a bien en soi, as a good in and of itself. And I am certainly not trying to dispute that value of trying to have intercultural communication and engagement and respect. So I'm not opposed to the ethics of translation. However, I think sometimes the regime of the ethical is often invoked in highly universal terms to deal with something that's far messier, which are the messiness of the politics, the politics on the ground, the politics of colloquialism, of colloquial usage in the street, where you encounter really serious problems of class difference, of caste difference, of wealth difference and income inequality, of elite education and non-elite, of demotic and sacred, and all of those things that a universalist ethical approach, it's not that it's opposed to dealing with that, but it tends to kind of sweep it under the table. And so I guess I'm not sure I'm going to sign on to an idea of an ethics of untranslatability, but that term untranslatability carries with it for me a certain politics of pushback against universal ethics. So, that's a little bit simplifying your question, which probably was, pointing to something richer than that, but that's kind of what comes to mind as a certain resistance to ethics and also which ethics. This ethics tends to be very, very grounded, at least in my exposure to it, in a Judeo-Christian tradition. That doesn't mean there aren't ethical codes or codes of conduct in every society and ritual practice, but there's something very freighted about the invocation of ethics, at least in many Western contexts. And just think about it in the law. That's the ethical thing to do. Who's saying that? Who's invoking that? Who has the power to make that call? I think politics pushes it up from under and says, not so fast, and we're seeing this in interesting cases where people challenge the very terms or the very lexicons and the languages in which ethics is formulated. So, there is something white about ethics and the uses of it in many Anglophone contexts that I've seen, also with a history of imperialism or colonial domination. So I just can't separate it out from those specific usages.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you. Next question. And when you were talking about the sort of persistence and repurposing of cosmopolitanism, you alluded to the expansion of that term to include reflections on the technosphere. And maybe we're going in this direction now. What are the potential implications of technological advancements, such as AI, for the study of untranslatability? Small question there.
That one is huge. That one is huge. I'll just say one thing first. I was asked to do a version of this talk for a volume that's still in progress, around new ideas around cosmopolitanism, that initiated by Dipesh Chakrabarty. And of course, he was interested in giving it a more planetary cast, but I found myself surprised by how many of the participants and paper contributors talked about cosmopolitanism as the technosphere or as the arena of the digital, and this sort of pan-translatability through digital translation, through neural language networks now, with the new sophistication of machine translation. And it was a stretch for me a little bit at the beginning, especially, to say, oh, well, cosmopolitanism then means everything, right? I mean, really, how cosmopolitan is this if it's a form of, in a sense, a kind of universal cipher that it's cosmopolitan, perhaps in the sense it has a cultural consequences, economic consequences for knowledge production in this global sphere. It's a cipher of globalization, basically. And AI, in some ways, is in conjunction with neural language learning, which is another order of magnitude for machine translation. This is, I had a resistance to saying, to kind of hitching that to the earlier cosmopolitan disposition, which is more affective, which is more about the interaction of communities in human and also even animal or more than human species interactions. So, you know, and this brings us back to that early question that Spivak raised about how, you know, people inhabit, you know, what's the status of a community that's entirely virtual, or it's entirely inhabited in the computer, or and abstracted on some level from some form of actual encounter. Are we being just old-fashioned humanists to make that distinction? I don't think so. I think that once you get into replacement modes of human interaction, you get a certain streamlining of language, you get a certain, and here's the important political question for me, it amounts to an kind of unspoken or almost secret attack on plurilingualism, because it implies a set of instrumental values. I'm not against AI or big data corpora. You can do fantastic translation work with it. Let's just say you want to look at 15 translations of Nietzsche, and you had a program where you could flash them on the screen in 1 minute and really get down and dirty with, you know, what's these technological tools are fantastic. You could imagine a version of the Dictionary of Untranslatables, which we imagined from the get-go, but for various copyright reasons and expenses, we couldn't actually produce a platform at the same time of publishing the book. But we purposely took Europe out of the title of the book. It was the vocabulary of European philosophy's Dictionary of Untranslatables. We took out European. Why? Wasn't just because we were against Europe in some blind way, but it was because we wanted this to become an object that would be kind of like a wiki format, where philosophizing could happen. You know, you could have an interactive program, and that language is not included in this book, and we couldn't include them all, obviously, but it could, as a technological object, become that. It could become an ongoing translational object, and in that sense, a kind of translational ecumen, and an open tool, an open source tool, where people could also write in and say, that's a really, you know, narrow European use of that definition of that term, or here we want to write a marked entry on its usage in Arabic, how that term works out. So, you know, this is what we imagined for that, and the increasing sophistication of research tools that use AI and other forms of search, these are great. So I'm not opposed to it. I'm not at all opposed to it. What I am opposed to is what I see more in the context of the humanities, which is a sort of idealization. We use the term in the US a lot of digital humanities, and a lot of the digital humanities projects, not all, but some, seem to be kind of empty of real ideas. And they also put in place a kind of normative judgment that's not questioned, which is that your endpoint is to have as few languages as possible, to have the computer enable communication and translation, as opposed to the messiness of the untranslatable. It gets lost in translation. That's just, and all that stuff is sort of gets filtered in some way. But no one ever made a decision to say, we don't want a plurilingual humanities curriculum anymore. But it's happening in large part because these tools render redundant or obsolete the hard work of translating. But to me, that's where new conceptualization happens, where you hit brick walls, where you have to really do some hard work of recognizing impasse and saying, no, this isn't going to be translatable, or no, this is doesn't exist in another language. So don't try to translate it. Put a placeholder and say, there is no word here. You know, that's not something that that hard work, which I think engenders thinking, and even someone like Heidegger, you can see the way he works with the Greek concept. This is how he thinks. He thinks and he philosophizes in translation and untranslatability. That to me leads to certain kinds of critical concept formation and a critique of late capitalism that doesn't just come from being against something or doing your good economic homework. And therefore it's important to have that, I think, displacement in your own language that comes from working in, and actually the hard work of language learning, its limitations. It produces a certain humility. And the last thing I'll say on this really important question is that, in a more positive vein, I founded a humanities lab with Alex Galloway, who's an important media theorist at NYU. He's written a lot on uncomputability and, how gaming is affecting all kinds of things. He's also really interested in philosophy. So the two of us got some funding and had a lab of about 15 graduate students and a bunch of speakers. It was during COVID, so we didn't meet in person. But our question was, how do we think translation between natural and digital languages? And what is a unit of translatability now? And that took us back to, questions around cybernetics in the mid-20th century, how one, the languages of DNA, and the question of the status of what is a language. What we call a language is actually a metaphor for a whole lot of other things. But the term language is treated as a transparent term that refers to something, but actually it doesn't refer to something we can all agree on. It's a metaphor for a lot of different phenomena. And there are huge splits in how people approach language, obviously, between the semanticists and the syntactic people, and between the analytic logicians and the people who are more interested in the poetic opacity and the associative logic. So, there are all kinds of things, I think, that are brought up by the computational humanities that they're not dealing with, that it's up to people like us working in the translational humanities but that doesn't mean we don't collaborate with them. I don't think it's warring camps. I think there are really productive discussions that are arising, and I'm advising dissertations now that are, one on Stiegler, another on and media, sort of medial translation, another on, how China entered the field of cybernetics. And there's just so many offshoots now that involve different language competencies and histories that are at this point of encounter between computational and translational humanities. So that was a very long-winded answer.
Excellent, very helpful answer though, and clearly a key question. We have actually reached the end of our allotted time. There are a number of other questions in the Q&A question. I think the range of questions here are really witness to the richness of what you've shared with us, Emily. Question around use of intermediary languages and whether they create a sort of default Anglo-normativity, questions on cosmopolitanism, contextualism, and pluralism, around global citizenship as well. If I'm, and Munira, if I could just ask, maybe we could just take an extra 5 minutes for one final question, because I think there's a question here from our lab colleague Mohammed Al-Waish, which I think would probably be a useful one to finish on, if that's okay. And Emily, do you mind just one more question?
No,
Is
by
that
all means.
okay? Because I think we could
Yes.
carry on. We could carry on all
I
night.
won't,
But
I won't
yeah.
answer in such length.
Yeah. But so, question from Mohammed Al-Waish, which is on the concept of terrestrial humanism and redefining translation as a cultural bridge, which makes me think to a certain extent of Ngugi's recent book on language of languages, but a cultural bridge that promotes diversity and difference rather than as a tool for imposing a unified cultural perspective or erasing local particularities. And that echoes with I think another question further down, which cites that specifically in the context of Arab intellectuals, saying, look, are we talking about a model that can honor both local identities and universal justice and maintain the tension between them, navigate the tension between asserting vernacular identity and engaging in global discourse on issues like Palestinian rights? So I wondered, just to finish, Emily, that question about cultural bridge as opposed to imposition of unified cultural perspective. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, I have someone who I met through working on the Dictionary of Untranslatables. He did an Arabic version of it, but only of the political terms like liberalism and democracy. So, and this is Ali Ben Makhlouf, who was teaching in at Paris Créteil, but also in Rabat for many years, and is now left Paris to found a whole new center of African languages and cultures in Morocco. He's running that. And the two of us taught a course together in Casablanca. We did a 10-day course, and we looked at, we just threw out 4 different kinds of terms, norma, I think it was justice. I'm not going to pronounce it, Sharia, law, use, as in, and this was, I think he brought in the question of hawk, and there were all of these nuances that could only, and it was a group of students, a third Moroccan, a third French, and a third from NYU, from all different nationalities. In fact, they weren't all US. It was quite something, in a sense. The terrestrial humanism part comes from collaborative work, I would say. It's very, very important. But there are also some wonderful novels and films that are fantastic teaching tools for looking at problems of translation within the sphere of the world courts or the administration of justice and the clashes between universalism. There's one I'm particularly fond of by a writer named Katie Kitamura called Intimacies. And it's about a Japanese translator who's grown up partly in America, who goes to The Hague and is translating, becomes part of a translator for an African war criminal. And there's an Arabic client as well. And the dynamics of the European courtroom, and how the placement of the translators behind the glass in the booths, but sometimes coming out and catching the eye of the people they're translating for, the sort of extraordinary drama of the courtroom, even as it aspires to be a space of utter neutrality, just like the language of the law, trying to be neutral. That's one way I'd answer this. I think it's such an important question of, the idea of how you honor identities and yet create certain kinds of and local particularities, but also somehow confront the imperatives of a certain kind of vernacular signifying that has been carefully screened out by the language. Law wants to narrow things. They want to narrow the idea of liability and restrict it as much as possible. That's the drive of the law. And this is something that interests me, is all, and yet you can use the law in so many fascinating ways. I've been working in one chapter on questions of how notions of liability or reparation enter into repair for forms of speech unfreedom that are not what the law calls freedom of speech, or at least American law calls freedom of speech. And that's the kind of interference on the level, how you can use some of the terms of the law to problematize its premises and its protocols. That's I think an area that I've been grappling with a lot in this book, and one of the reasons it's taking me so long to finish it.
Emily, thank you so much. Apologies to those who place the fascinating questions in the Q&A, but we haven't had time to address those. Apologies also for slightly running over. It's later in some of the time zones represented here than in others. So I think we're going to have to draw the session to a close. Emily, thank you for reminding us of the continued power of untranslatability as a concept to stimulate such rich debates. Very much looking forward to what is just translation when you finish that book, and when we all have a chance to continue the conversations on and around your current work. And thank you again for such a fascinating paper. Munira, are you going to say a few words of farewell on behalf of the chair?